Hi, this is Marc Cameron, licensed marriage and family therapist and co-host on New Life Live. On many shows, we have callers asking us about how to have a difficult conversation, and today I want to teach you how to do that. Having a needed conversation with a person to express your feelings or hold a boundary is an act of courage, and since often the conversation is challenging for both parties, I want to show you how to do this well. So the first thing I would say is to set up an agreed upon time to have the conversation, if you can. This ensures that you'll have the right amount of time to communicate all your thoughts without the other person needing to get somewhere else. It also allows them to prepare and be in the right frame of mind for the conversation. If the other person's prepared, they can also consider their words, which will likely have the conversation go better. Sometimes it's not always possible or practical to give someone advance notice, but when you can, I would say this is a best practice. Both parties being emotionally prepared will likely be one of the biggest predictors for how the conversation is going to go. I would consider, if you can, praying with that person before you start. So, when you start with what is at least one thing you appreciate or respect about that person. You want to affirm the person or your relationship with that person if you can. Begin by communicating that so that they know you're trying to be balanced and you don't see them as all bad. And if you can't think of anything to say, at least say, I appreciate that you're willing to hear me out. Ask for permission to share, especially if you don't have time to schedule the conversation. Saying something like, would it be okay for me to share with you my thoughts on something? When we ask for permission, it challenges the other person to keep listening because then they've agreed to hear us out. Also, if you're concerned about a reaction that they may have or a distraction they may have, state this up front. Most of the time, the other person will give you permission when you ask, and that helps hold themselves accountable to listen and not react or distract. And if they don't listen well, or they do react or distract, this validates your concern and makes your position stronger. Next, state your intentions and desired outcome. I think it's important to tell the other person the topic quite quickly so they know where the conversation's going. I've noticed that sometimes when people are nervous, their lead into the conversation can be quite ambiguous or long because they're trying not to make the other person feel bad or mad, but then the other person who we're trying to have the conversation with becomes anxious or upset as they try and anticipate where the conversation's leading. So try and get quickly to what you want to talk about. Also, think about a resolution that would be beneficial to both of you and let them know what that may be. The goal is to try and take as much anxiety as you can around the conversation so both of your brains can think and process clearly. High anxiety leads to anger, defensiveness, and non-productive conversations as our brains are processing mostly from the emotional side. So here's what the opener might sound like. Thank you for being willing to hear me out today. I do appreciate that you're someone that loves our family and seeks improvement. I want to talk to you about something that I recognize could be challenging to hear, but because I care deeply about the relationship, I believe it's important for us to have the conversation. I'd like to share my feelings about some interactions that have occurred between us recently. My goal is that this conversation redirects us back on a path where we can both share our concerns with each other in productive ways. I do have a concern that you might become defensive and not hear me out fully. Would it be possible for me to share my thoughts with you and you hear me out first, knowing that I will commit to hearing you out afterwards? And then I would briefly pause for their agreement. So now you've got that part out of the way. There's a skill to speaking without blaming or accusing, where the other person can acknowledge your feelings without taking on blame. You do this through using I statements that describe your feelings and experiences. I feel, I saw, I heard, my experience is. Those are all examples of I statements that describe your subjective experience. When we use I statements, this makes our position subjective and lessens the need for the other person to try and argue about facts, which stops them from hearing what we're trying to communicate with them. Communicate actual feelings. If someone starts to argue with your I feel statement, then it's possible you didn't use an emotion word to describe why their action was so bothersome to you. Make sure your statements begin with a feeling word. Many times people will say, I feel that you, and then a thought follows that states a perceived fact. Emotions are important because they add context to our thoughts and actions, and so that's why it's so important that we communicate these. Emotions are actually what people empathize with, and it's possible to empathize with an emotion and not agree with a behavior or perspective. Because feelings are perspective, they're harder to argue with. So if you find yourself going back and forth over perceived facts, make sure that you didn't assert a perceived objective fact when you were actually trying to share a feeling with the other person. Now, criticizing and voicing irritations, these are not the same as sharing your feelings. The difference between a complaint and a criticism is complaints are used to voice displeasure over an act or circumstance and how it affected the individual. Criticisms are comments designed to attack the personality or character of another person. A complaint would be, I don't like it when you do. A criticism would be, you are insensitive. Voicing irritations are usually done by dumping rather than sharing emotions. It's not bad to tell others what upsets us, but there are ways to share that encourage others to respond to our emotions, and there are also ways to tell others about our pain which produce resistance to us. So when we share, it should have an element of vulnerability and delicacy to it, because if we're wanting someone to consider our feelings and be careful with them, we want to hand them over carefully. Take and demonstrate ownership for managing your feelings rather than blaming the other person for being the cause of them and then expecting them to make adjustments to make you feel better. So this would be the difference between saying, you're annoying me and I'm feeling annoyed. In the second statement, we're taking responsibility for our annoyance rather than placing that on the other person. Also, stay away from absolutes. Always, never, every, all the time. People push back against absolutes. In my family, I used to have a statement that I would say, things are almost never always. And I would say that every time I caught myself using an absolute and every time I caught one of my kids using an absolute, just as a gentle reminder to remind us to be subjective and be fair. Apologize for your part. You're having a challenging conversation and you're likely going to make a request or hold a boundary, but what is one thing that you can own in the situation and commit to working on? You might even say something like, I take responsibility for letting this issue go unresolved for so long. I own a part in that and I've committed to not continuing that unhelpful dynamic. So sometimes the thing that we own is actually something that we haven't done. And like I said, follow up a complaint or concern with a request. What is it that you need in response to your feeling, right? Link emotions to a corresponding emotional need. If you feel unheard, then you need to be heard. If you feel misunderstood, then you need to be understood. And then if needed, state a boundary that you have. What happens if the conversation gets circular, if it doesn't go to plan, if the other person becomes argumentative? In that situation, calmly end the conversation until a time you can come back and finish it, or just by simply reinforcing your request or your boundary. Thank the person for listening to you and then give them a chance to respond to you. Hopefully you've modeled well for them how to share their feelings, and so they'll do the same, and now you have the opportunity to model for them how to listen. And remember, you don't have to agree with what they say. Lastly, self-soothe and be aware and secure enough to know when it is and it is not your issue. If the other person is too angry to hear what you have to say, and you are being calm and thoughtful about what you've got to say, you don't necessarily have to own that you're doing something wrong. Greater connection and disclosure may come in the next interaction that you have with that person once they're able to trust that you can bring your concerns to them in a secure way. Anticipate objections or reactions, and then practice this with a friend or counselor so that you can do this confidently. Hopefully this has been helpful for you, and I'll see you next time.